keen gambler Alex Salmond.
And then after losing the independence referendum, an astonishing result in 2015, getting 1.5 million votes, almost wiping out Labour.
No overall majority, but emerging triumphant, Nicola Sturgeon says the SNP will now form a minority government.
Yesterday, the SNP made history. We became the first party to win a third consecutive Scottish Parliament election and secure a third term in office.
This result means the Conservatives will now replace Labour as the official opposition here in the Scottish Parliament, something that just a few years ago would have been unthinkable.
Here in Scotland, the issue of independence still looms large, and Labour's deputy leader told me that's where his party failed.
There's no doubt that the referendum split Scotland, and Labour, in terms of the referendum, has not since then been able to set out a clear position on where we are in the Constitution. We need to do that.
Plans for a second referendum weren't in the SNP's manifesto, but some think last night's win won't do the cause any harm.
So before the 2015 election, the Rainbow Unicorn Party were already polling at levels that would have been inconceivable just a year prior, especially since the year prior was the same year that the referendum had occurred. Now, if you follow the media, you'd have seen the rise of the SNP being described as merely coinciding with the death of Labour in Scotland. But speculation of independence, or support for it anyway, was still a hot topic. There's no getting away from that fact. But Sturgeon came out on a few occasions to state that their votes would not be seen as an endorsement for independence. That would have gone in one ear and out the other to those that wanted independence, but however, it may have been true to some degree, but there's no denying that the 2015 election, then the subsequent 2016 election, wins which were described by the media as historic and landslide-esque, had something to do with the 2014 referendum. And personally, as far as I'm concerned, it further goes to prove that there was some form of foul play somewhere along the lines. You can't really explain losing a referendum with just 6 seats to your name and then going on a year later to win quote-unquote historic votes without it playing at least a reasonable factor. And by that I mean upset over the referendum result. Now, in order for there to be upset over the referendum result, that would suggest foul play. The SNP may or may not have genuinely thought to themselves, hypothetically, that most of their success derived from the fall of Labour. But you're not telling me that the idea that momentum for independence was responsible for elevating them to the position that they were in haven't crossed their minds at least once or twice. Come on now. In my opinion, they knew damn well that the majority of their newfound followers wanted independence. They knew.
Just frequently ask me 2 questions about the EU referendum. The first is, how can you support independence and back Scotland's membership of the EU? Well, the answer to that is simple. I believe that independent countries must cooperate to tackle common challenges. Every member of the EU is an independent country working with others for the greater good. The second question is whether a Brexit vote will mean a second independence referendum. Well, here's what the SNP manifesto at the recent election said about that. The Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the European Union against our will. Now, I'm clear that if Scotland does indeed face that prospect of being taken out of Europe against our will, then that option is on the table. But to be clear, that situation only arises if Scotland votes Remain next week. If Scotland votes to leave, then that premise for independence doesn't arise.
Back-to-back landslide victories with a core audience of independent supporters. Now you're directing your independent supporters to vote a specific way. Then comes the EU referendum. The result comes out the way that it did, and then on paper it appears as if Scotland wishes to remain part of the EU. Now, I know, she knows, and the people that voted in that referendum know why they voted the way that they did. And Sturgeon especially knows damn well that 62% does not represent support for the EU. It represents support for independence. To a degree anyway. How much of that 62%, who knows? But with 2 landslide victories, and her specifically telling the people that made up the bulk of that landslide victory and the one after to vote a specific way, because failure to do so would mean independence would be a pipe dream. It would fizzle into nothingness for the time being, and as the speculation was growing in relation to their election wins regarding independence, kind of stands to reason that they had to ensure that they voted the way that she wanted them to. And lo and behold, ever since then, well, it's been the Sturgeon show.
Scotland spoke clearly and positively for the European Union. We opted to remain members of the European Union in the votes that Scotland cast last week. Since I've been here today, I've found enormous interest in the referendum result, as you would expect, and I've also had a sympathetic response to the position Scotland now finds itself in, facing the prospect of being taken out of the European Union against our will, a position not of our making and not one that we wanted.
Sturgeon feigned ignorance and played the role of the woman simply standing up for her people. Scotland's been dragged out against her as well. Scotland didn't vote for this, etc, etc. We've been cast aside, treated with contempt, ignored, etc, etc. And as time progressed, as we're all aware, the revisionist history was stepped up a gear, and it got to a stage where claims were being made about the 2014 referendum, and all of a sudden apparently it was nothing to do with foul play or the death of the Labour Party, and everything to do with promises made that if we voted to stay in 2014 we would be able to keep that vital EU membership. Such bollocks. Absolute bollocks. But ever since this pivotal moment, people in Scotland have had to listen to this shit. Now if you're supportive of the EU, that's fine. I don't really give a shit. You do you. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. My gripe with this woman and this party and their revisionist puppet cultists is the fact that they can't drop the name of independence. They simply pretend it's a rerun of 2014. They act as if nothing's changed. They act as if they're a bunch of nationalists. They act as if it's the independence movement, etc, etc. They act as if they're speaking on behalf of the people of Scotland. They act as if this is all organic and nothing to do with manipulation. Now she was, on paper at this point, you could have argued that this was all about obtaining an independence referendum. Well, it was only a few months after this occurred that it was put on the back burner. It was shelved because Nicola Sturgeon continued what she had been doing prior to the EU referendum. Everything in her power to try to stop Brexit. Prior to the referendum, if you recall, she was trying to get all these clauses to ensure that the referendum went the way of Remain. Because for a woman who apparently is so hell-bent on wanting independence for her nation, she was putting a hell of a lot of obstacles in the way.
Things, though, have changed. The SNP are the strongest they've been for years. They're riding high in the polls. One survey put the independence cause on 50% this week. And their strong anti-Brexit message, well, that chimes well with an electorate that voted nearly 2/3 to Remain. That strength explains Nicola Sturgeon's bullishness today, demanding an independence referendum next year.
The process by which we choose Scotland's future must be capable of actually achieving independence. It must...
So this was the beginning of her talking up a second independence referendum, via gaining permission, of course. All of this because they spent so long trying to stop Brexit that they've left themselves with little to no time at all to act upon the mandate that they would have been able to act upon legally if they'd allowed Brexit to occur. But instead of that, they voted against every deal that was put forward, for shit as they were. They did everything in their power to continuously put barriers in the way, pushing for delays and stalls, trying to stop the process, their court cases, etc, etc. They were no different to any of the shower shit down in Westminster. The only difference, of course, being that Nicola Sturgeon got to play the role of the brave, marvellous woman who's simply sticking up for the people in this country. They voted a specific way, so she will do everything she can to fight for what you voted for, without having to acknowledge whatsoever that the majority of people, I would argue, but let's just say for argument's sake half of that 62%, a chunk of people voted a specific way because of what she specifically said. We'll be winning people over, but it's the crybaby routine, giving it the big I am at their podiums. It's remaining in the European Union, but it's not independence they're talking about. It's remaining in the European Union, because one thing is abundantly clear, and has been since Nicola Sturgeon took over the SNP, they're globalists. But they're getting away with a lot of shit.
Allow majority support to be expressed clearly and unambiguously. It must be legal and it must have the recognition of the international community. And my call is that the referendum must happen next year.
Because the year after that is the 2021 elections. Still to this day they won't acknowledge that. However.
And we are getting ready.
And they continued to peddle the people of Scotland having a right to determine their own future routine all the way up to the election, the majority of seats. But it probably did play its role in ensuring that they won the majority of seats. But again, independence support and European Union support is a conflation deliberately done by Nicola Sturgeon. She uses support for independence to make it appear as if it's support on paper for Europe.
I want to go straight to Glasgow and talk to the leader of the Scottish National Party and First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. First Minister, very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about the SNP's strong performance in this election. And was it something that you were expecting at the start of the evening?
I was expecting a good performance. I was expecting us to win the election and win it handsomely. But I think the results that we're seeing recorded
I bet you were.
This evening.
We're also hoping for a hung parliament so you could lock the Tories out and stop Brexit, but you know.
Somewhat exceed the expectations that I had. So it's been an exceptional night for the SNP, and you know, Scotland has sent a very clear message. We don't want a Boris Johnson Conservative government. We don't want to leave the European Union.
Now that's again the conflation I just mentioned prior. You spent a month and a half talking up a second independence referendum only for you then to turn around after the fact and say this somehow indicates support for remaining in the European Union. You're a fucking liar. They're winning another election by implying that voting for them would achieve what they really want. She was quick to come out after the fact and do something similar to what she did a few years prior when she shelved independence for the time being. She came out and called for patience, much to the dismay of many people that voted for her. The likes of Beta Blackford would continuously give their 2 cents in relation to still holding out hope for a referendum by the end of the year. But if that failed, then there was always the election the year after. Well, they changed their tune, because it was all this year. We heard nothing other than the fact that it couldn't be 2021. Or the year prior, I should say. Now all of a sudden that's acceptable. That's strange. But of course, in the midst of all the accusations of betrayal and so on and so forth, something else has emerged. And I just cannot believe that people are accepting this. You know that bit of false hope that I gave you to win the election? Well, you know how I said in January that you had to be patient because I couldn't act upon the promises that I made? Well, it was the coronavirus's fault now. Yeah, that's right. Oh wow. Always next year, boys. Always next year.
I think there are more men involved in attending The fact of the matter is women are no less able, no less intelligent, no less capable of getting on in politics than men are. So the fact that we don't always have, broadly speaking, gender balance says that there are systemic institutional barriers to women progressing, a systemic institutional barrier to systemic institutional barriers to women progressing. Second thing, and I speak, I suppose, very much from the perspective of Scotland and the UK here, and it will be true in other countries like us. I think we have to, and this is why Heather's work is so hugely important, reach across the generations and the genders. I had a conversation with a young man a couple of weeks ago, 19 years old, lovely young man. I'm not going to say who he is, but it's a young man I'm very fond of. It's somebody I know very well, and very progressive, liberal attitudes and everything else, and had a conversation with him about feminism, and he articulated to me his view of feminism from the perspective of a young man growing up today. And his view was very much that, well, women have equal rights, and sometimes it now feels to me as a young man that feminism is about trying to undermine my rights. Now, that's just not how, but if that was coming to me from him as a young man today, then that says we've still got a lot of work to do, and we've probably got to think about how we do that now across the generations and the genders. Systemic institutional barriers to women progressing. To the refugee crisis. And so now, perhaps more than ever, we need strong, positive, resolute voices from all faiths and all nationalities, which unite to oppose discrimination and which celebrate understanding, compassion and diversity. It helps individuals and promotes interfaith relations. It plays a positive role in Europe, in Scottish national life and in the local communities it represents. So I'm delighted to be here tonight to help to celebrate the work of the Society, but much more importantly than that, to celebrate Scotland's wonderful diversity and to promote and to dedicate myself and my government to working with all of you to continue to strengthen our interfaith relationships and the strength and the diversity of this wonderful country that all of us are proud to call home. Probably over the last few years, actually, I've become conscious of the way I behaved when I was a much younger woman in politics, and looking back on it, as a young woman in politics, even more so than is the case today, I would be surrounded most of the time by, no offence to anybody in this audience who's about to fall into the category I'm going to describe, middle-aged white men. Difficult. I mean, we were chatting earlier on, and I was. Can I preface my answer here by recognising there'll be people in this audience who support Scottish independence, people who passionately oppose Scottish independence. Who knows? There might even be some people who don't have an opinion, although that is perhaps less likely. I was chatting to Elif earlier on and saying, if I could turn the clock back 90 years to the establishment of my party and choose its name all over again, I wouldn't choose the name it's got just now. I would call it something other than the Scottish National Party. Now, what those of us who do support Scottish independence are all about, it could not be further removed from some of what you would recognise as nationalism in other parts of the world. I mean, I believe, for example, two things that I believe that I think run so strongly through the Scottish independence movement are, firstly, that it doesn't matter where you come from. If Scotland is your home and you live here and you feel you have a stake in the country, you are Scottish and you have as much say over the future of the country as I